A luxury yacht glided into the harbor, its passengers laughing, unaware or unconcerned that beneath their bow lay a weathered boat built by an old man's hands. They crushed it without a glance. To them, it was just driftwood. But that boat held a lifetime of memories, of sacrifice, of silence earned at sea. Next morning, the town awoke to 6 Navy warships quietly anchoring in formation. No press, no announcement, just solemn presence. No one understood why until the old man stepped out onto his porch. And that's where the real story begins. In the quiet town of Harborside, where fog clung to the shoreline like an old memory, lived a man who rarely spoke, but whose presence echoed across the water. Thomas Reynolds, 72, rose every morning before the sky could decide between night and day. The streets were still asleep, but the sea, his old companion, was already calling. His knees creaked like the dock beneath his feet, but he moved with practiced purpose, stepping onto a boat that looked more like a relic than a vessel. Liberty Child had weathered 4 decades of salt and sun. Its paint had long since surrendered to the elements, and its hull groaned with every tide. But to Thomas, it was beautiful, because he had built it with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. He'd returned from Vietnam a different man. Like many, he came back with more scars than medals. But unlike many, he didn't speak of them. Instead, he listened to the creak of wood, to the rhythm of waves, to the hush that only the sea could offer. It was here, in this craft, shaped by grief and memory, that he found quiet. Not peace, not really, but something close enough to live with. The town had changed around him. Where once fishermen mended nets, now yoga instructors led beach classes. Seafood shacks had become oyster bars with names like Neptune's Garden. And yet Thomas remained, an old sailor in a new world. Some nodded when they passed him on the docks. Others simply walked by. He didn't mind. He was used to being overlooked. After all, Liberty Child wasn't built to impress, it was built to endure. Most mornings, he'd steer toward the harbor mouth, casting crab pots as the sky shifted from slate to gold. He had a favorite spot, just past the rocky point, where dolphins sometimes played and the air smelled like salt and memory. Out there, no one asked him for stories. The silence did the remembering. There were days when the sea was the only place that made sense. And Thomas Reynolds, though forgotten by many, never forgot who he was. Not a hero, not a victim, just a man who had given his best years to the sea and still gave her his mornings. It was a Wednesday, the kind of quiet morning that made the town feel like it was holding its breath. Thomas had left the dock just after 5 a.m., the familiar chill of sea air clinging to his flannel shirt. He moved slowly, as always, but deliberately, checking the lines and adjusting the weight of the pots. Everything is in rhythm, everything known. There was comfort in that. By 6:15, Liberty Child floated still near the harbor mouth, her moorings secured, her captain sipping lukewarm coffee from a dented steel thermos. The sun had just begun to bleed over the horizon, bathing the water in soft orange. For a brief moment, everything felt exactly right. Then came the engines. A deep, mechanical growl, out of place in the sleepy harbor. At first, Thomas thought it was a tanker passing offshore. But as the rumble grew louder, closer, he turned, and what he saw struck him still. La Vida. The name gleamed in gold letters across the brilliant white hull of a yacht so massive it seemed to swallow the dock as it rounded the bend. 600 tons of floating indulgence, slicing through the harbor like it owned the sea. Sleek, immaculate, merciless. Thomas blinked, jaw tightening. He recognized the boat, or rather the man behind it. Jackson Reed, Tech Money. Silicon Valley transplant. 38, maybe 40, with a blinding smile and a portfolio big enough to buy anything, except awareness. Thomas raised both arms high, signaling his position. "Hey, I'm moored here," he shouted. His voice vanished into the drone of the engines. Up on the yacht's upper deck, Reed clinked champagne glasses with a group of fashionable guests. Their laughter trailed behind them like perfume detached from everything beneath. One woman pointed at something in the water, another took a photo. Not one looked down. The security patrol boat drifted nearby, its officer expressionless, half watching, half pretending not to see. Thomas stood up, waving again, louder this time. "Hey, You need to swing wide. There's a boat here. Still, no change. The yacht barreled forward, its bow looming like a cliff face. And then came the sound. A sickening, tearing crack of old wood against steel, the stern of Liberty Child folded in on itself like a crumpling memory. Thomas dove toward the dock, joints screaming in protest. He hit the boards hard, breath driven from his chest. By the time he turned around, Liberty Child was gone, shattered, sinking, torn apart by luxury that couldn't be bothered to notice her. Floating on the water's surface, spinning slowly in the wake, was his flag, the one he'd flown every single day for 40 years. Its red stripes unfurled like open wounds, bleeding into the sea foam. The yacht's engines finally cut, silence returned to the harbor. But it wasn't peace. It was absence. Reed leaned over the railing, his voice carrying with effortless arrogance. It's just an old fishing tub. Get over it. Thomas rose to his feet, shaky but straight. His hands trembled as he stepped toward the dock's edge, reaching down and pulling the soaked flag from the water. He pressed it to his chest, soaking through his shirt. His face was unreadable, no anger, no shouting. Just quiet, just loss. Around him, a crowd had gathered. Joggers paused mid-stride. Workers stood with tools in hand. Tourists held up phones, some already filming. No one stepped forward. From behind him, the harbor security officer finally approached. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, hesitant, "I'll need to file a report." But Thomas wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the flag, on what used to be his life. From the deck of the yacht, someone laughed. Another champagne cork popped. As Thomas turned to walk away, his back straight despite the weight in his heart, a notification sound pinged across a tourist's phone. A video was uploaded, captioned, "Old man, old boat, old news." By noon, the wreck had been cleared, just another inconvenience dealt with. Thomas's past, his sanctuary, was erased in the morning. No apology came, no acknowledgement. No one asked what that boat had meant or why he held the flag like it was the last thing tethering him to something solid. In a harbor now built for leisure, it seemed there was no room left for memory. The house on the bluff had never felt so quiet. Thomas sat alone at his kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee growing cold between his palms. Through the front window, the sea was still there, restless, eternal, but something in its rhythm had shifted. It no longer called to him the way it used to, or maybe it did, and he simply had no vessel left to answer. His jacket still smelled like sea brine and diesel. His hands, weathered from decades of rope and wood, shook as he opened the small wooden chest he hadn't touched in years. Inside were the remnants of another life, a different war, faded photographs, letters brown with age, a rusted Zippo with a Navy emblem barely visible beneath the scratches. At the very bottom, folded with military precision, lay a flag, clean, untouched by salt or time. The one they'd given him when he retired. He ran his fingers over the stars, feeling the weight of all it symbolized. A flag had been lowered when he left the Navy. A flag had sunk when Liberty Child was destroyed. And no one cared. That night, his grandson Michael arrived from college, eyes wide with indignation. "You're going to sue him, right?" Michael asked, still standing in the doorway. "That guy destroyed your boat. He should pay for that." Thomas didn't look up. His fingers traced the edge of the flag like it might vanish if he let go. "He didn't hit me," he said softly. "Just something nobody ever cared about." "But you cared," Michael insisted, his voice rising. "You built that boat. That was your life." "Yes," Thomas nodded. "To me." Later, after Michael had gone to bed, still muttering about lawyers and justice, Thomas opened the old logbook he'd kept for over 40 years. Inside were careful handwritten entries, weather patterns, catch sizes, sea conditions, a sailor's record of days past, of life lived at sea. Now he added one more line, just 7 words. "First day without Liberty Child. No condolences offered." He paused, then added a second sentence, "But I can still hear the water culling." He closed the book, pushed it gently aside, and turned on the television. The local news was covering Reed's yacht again. Levita was now officially the largest private vessel to ever dock in Harborside. The anchor smiled through perfectly white teeth, celebrating economic revival, and a new era of affluence for our beloved coastal gem. There was no mention of a collision, no whisper of what had been broken beneath that gleaming bow. Online, the story had gone viral, but not in the way that honored anything worth remembering. The comments stung not with direct insults, but with the blithe cruelty of detachment. Old boat was an eyesore anyway. These boomers gotta let go. But with the times, man, buy a modern boat. Even the harbor master had called earlier, polite, distant. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds," he said, "but your vessel wasn't fitted with radar reflectors or the modern safety lights. The insurance company won't cover the damages. It wasn't compliant with current standards." Thomas didn't argue. Didn't mention that Liberty Child had been grandfathered in under older maritime codes, that he passed every inspection. For 40 years, not a single accident had occurred aboard that boat. What was the point? Liberty Child was gone. And yet, as night deepened and the lights along the shoreline flickered one by one, something inside him refused to go dark. He stepped out onto his porch, eyes drawn to the open water. Somewhere out there, the wreckage of his boat lay on the ocean floor, claimed by the same sea that had once been his solace. The breeze whispered across the flag he draped over the railing, catching it gently like an unseen hand. He let it be. Let the wind lift the corners and fold it slightly as if even the ocean still remembered what it stood for. The ache wasn't just in his knees or his back. It was deeper. The kind of pain that has no language. The pain of something sacred broken, dismissed, and swept away like trash on the tide. He'd never expected compensation, never asked for recognition. But in that moment, as the waves lapped against the rocks below, he allowed himself to want one thing: respect. And for the first time in 40 years, he had no place to go at dawn. The fog came in heavy that morning, clinging to the masts and swallowing the shoreline in a shroud of white silence. Thomas sat on the porch, as he always did, a fresh cup of coffee, untouched in his hands. The harbor was invisible, hidden behind a wall of mist, but he knew it was there, the way a blind man knows the shape of a room he's walked 1,000 times. Since Liberty Child had been lost, he still woke at the same hour. The sea's rhythm hadn't changed, even if his role in it had. He was a sailor with no vessel, a map with no compass. The first sound that broke the stillness wasn't birds or wind, but the harbor foghorn. 3 long, deliberate blasts. Thomas froze. That signal wasn't for pleasure boats. It was the call for large military vessels approaching restricted waters. He stood, heart skipping in a way it hadn't for years. As the fog began to lift, dark gray silhouettes emerged from the mist like ghosts. 1, 2, then 4 more. 6 U.S. Navy ships moving in formation, clean, silent, unwavering. Not one local had heard a word about naval maneuvers. No news station had mentioned a visit. No banners welcomed dignitaries. And yet there they were, guided missile destroyers and patrol vessels creeping into the civilian harbor with the grace of giants. Their decks were lined with uniformed sailors at attention, and from each mast the American flag flew at half-mast. Ahmed stepped off his porch without realizing it. His cane was forgotten, the coffee was abandoned. Something old stirred inside him, a muscle memory from decades past. His spine straightened, his breathing slowed. Not fear, not awe, just readiness. The town began to awaken as the ships anchored. Storefronts flipped signs to close. Children were pulled from summer programs, and teachers and shopkeepers spilled into the streets. No one spoke above a whisper, as if instinctively understanding that this wasn't spectacle. It was remembrance. From his vantage point on the bluff, Thomas saw it all. And then he saw the man on the lead ship's deck, Rear Admiral James Nelson, dress whites, immaculate posture. In his gloved hands, he held a perfectly folded American flag, the triangle of stars facing outward, the flag of a fallen sailor. Thomas's chest tightened. That fold, he had performed it dozens of times, for shipmates lost to storms and war, for friends who never made it back to shore. Now it was for him. He made his way down to the harbor, step by aching step. The crowd parted as he approached, no one knowing why they moved aside, only that they should. The admiral descended the gangway with slow reverence, a small honor guard flanking him. The moment his boots touched the dock, he raised his hand in salute. "Chief Petty Officer Reynolds," Nelson said, his voice carrying like a bell in the still morning. "Permission to come ashore and render honors." Thomas's arm came up, the salute crisp despite the years. "Permission granted, Admiral." That one breathed. The Admiral turned to face the crowd now gathered across the pier. 43 years ago, he began, this man saved 128 lives aboard the USS Constellation. During a catastrophic systems failure in the South China Sea, he manually sealed a ruptured cooling compartment. Toxic gases had already begun to spread. He sustained burns over 60% of his body to keep those gases from reaching the crew quarters. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Many turned toward Thomas with new eyes, tracing the scars on his hands, the faint discoloration along his jawline they'd never really seen before. "He refused the Navy Cross," Nelson continued. "He asked only that we take care of the boys who did make it home. Since then, he has lived quietly among you, asking nothing." The Admiral paused, eyes narrowing slightly as they drifted toward the gleaming white yacht moored nearby. La vida. Yesterday, his vessel was destroyed in this harbor. No assistance was offered, no respect was shown. The flag he served under was allowed to sink without ceremony. We turned, and a young sailor stepped forward with a wooden plaque. Hand-carved and polished, its brass plate is engraved with simple words, "For the man who kept the sea safe, even after service, the United States Navy does not forget its own." Thomas accepted it with both hands, cradling it the same way he had held the soaked flag. But this time, he wasn't alone. All around the harbor, sailors saluted, flags were raised in precision, children stood still, wide-eyed. Tourists lowered their phones. Even the marina workers removed their hats. And somewhere above the fog and ceremony, something shifted. Not just air pressure, not just mood, but memory. Admiral Nelson leaned in, speaking softly now. "Your grandson contacted us, said you wouldn't ask for help." Thomas gave a small shrug. "Wasn't your problem. It was just a boat." "No, Chief," Nelson said firmly. "It was never just a boat, and you were never just a sailor." As the ceremony concluded, the ships remained silent. No engines revving, no horns blasting, just presence, weight, meaning. And as Thomas stood amidst a sea of faces, turned finally toward him, not with pity but with understanding, he realized something had changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. He was seen. Long after the ships had docked, after the last salute faded into silence, the town remained still. No one rushed to reopen their shops, the latte machine stayed cold. Even the gulls seemed to quiet, as if unwilling to disturb what had taken root in the harbor that morning. It wasn't a spectacle they'd witnessed. It was something older, weightier, like the sea itself had spoken. Thomas didn't return home right away. He stood on the dock long after the sailors had disembarked, the plaque still in his hands. He traced the letters, not to read them, but to feel their weight. People approached one by one, not with fanfare, but with gentleness. A shopkeeper handed him a brown paper bag with warm pastries. A teenager offered a folded letter with shaky handwriting. A local fisherman, silent for years, due to falling out over mooring space, tipped his hat and simply said, "You kept us safe." It was the beginning of something Thomas never expected to see again: remembrance. By evening, a new post had gone viral. Not one of mockery, but reverence. The live stream from the morning ceremony now trended nationwide. The hashtag had changed from Boomer Down to Veteran Salute. The tide had turned, not because someone demanded it, but because dignity, when held quietly, commands its own gravity. Even Reed, still aboard his floating fortress, was no longer laughing. He and his guests had watched from the top deck, unable to hide behind sunglasses and champagne flutes this time. When the Admiral had mentioned no respect was shown, Reed's face had tightened, just for a moment, but it was enough. enough for the crowd to turn. Enough to remind him that even money couldn't buy silence when shame had already arrived. And the next day, the town council held an emergency vote, unanimous. A stone marker was installed at the edge of the dock where Liberty Child once moored. The inscription read, Liberty Child, a vessel that carried more than one life. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just a quiet afternoon when locals came, touched the cold stone, and walked away with eyes a little redder than before. At first, the tourists didn't understand, but they paused anyway, read the plaque. Some asked questions, most simply stood for a few seconds longer than they had before. The changes were subtle at first. The marina stopped charging local fishermen premium slip fees. A few shops moved their local crafts displays from the back corners to the front windows. Children stopped running past the old-timers at the docks and instead started sitting beside them. And Thomas, he didn't resume his old routines because Liberty Child was gone, but he didn't disappear either. Each afternoon, he took a walk down to the dock where the marker stood. At first, it was just to sit. Then, he started bringing his old ropes and teaching knots to the neighborhood kids who lingered nearby. Word spread quickly. Within a week, 5 or 6 kids waited for him daily, some bringing notebooks, others just their hands and a quiet eagerness. This one's called a bowlin, he told a small girl named Lily, guiding her fingers. It's been saving sailors since before Columbus. Are you angry at the man who broke your boat? She asked suddenly, her wide eyes full of innocent sincerity. Thomas paused, rope in hand. No, he said finally. If not for him, maybe no one would have remembered that boat ever existed. She nodded as she understood. And in a way she did. Children recognize the truth better than most adults, especially when it's spoken without bitterness. That night, Thomas returned home and sat with his old logbook again. He didn't write about loss this time. Instead, he wrote, Some things don't return, but they echo, and some echoes become bridges. A few days later, something else happened, something he didn't expect. The harbor master arrived at his door, hat in hand, voice soft. I know this doesn't make up for anything, the man said, but the town council voted to issue you a permanent fishing permit. Free. For life. And the marine is offering you a slip, no charge, for whatever vessel you choose. Thomas didn't say much, just nodded once. That was enough. Was it rebuilding? Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the town had. And sometimes that was the greater miracle. The morning sky was brushed with silver when the sound of a horn, a small one, cheerful and sharp, echoed across Harborside. It wasn't the deep thrum of a yacht or the mournful wail of a freighter. It was something different. Familiar. Thomas was seated on his usual bench near the old mooring, his hands guiding a boy's fingers through a clove hitch when the sound caught his attention. He looked up. From the harbor entrance came a small wooden boat gliding gently over the water. Fresh varnish gleamed in the sunlight. Its lines were unmistakable, modest, purposeful, and deeply familiar. He rose to his feet slowly, heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. The boat turned toward the dock, moving with careful grace. On the stern, painted in crisp white lettering, Liberty's Child. Gasps rose from the growing crowd at the dock. Children stopped mid-step. Fishermen straightened their backs. Even the shopkeepers poked their heads from their storefronts. At the helm stood Michael, Thomas's grandson, grinning wide, eyes glassy. Surprise, Grandpa, he called. We built her for you. Thomas stepped forward but said nothing. The words had caught in his throat. Michael secured the lines as the vessel bumped gently against the dock. I found your old plans in the shed, he explained, breathless with excitement. We used your original measurements. The Boat Builders Association donated the lumber. Veterans from 4 different states came to help. People you've never even met. He ran his hand along the railing. It's not exactly the same. We added radar, new safety features, a nav system. But the soul? That's all yours. Thomas reached out, hand trembling, and touched the smooth, sun-warmed wood. The grain felt familiar beneath his palm, like the past saying hello in a new voice. His boots met the deck with the sure balance of a man born to the sea. He moved forward slowly, reverently, until he reached the bow. There, snapping proudly in the breeze, was a brand new American flag. For the man who kept faith, Michael said quietly, stepping aboard. Even when it felt like No one was watching. Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes burned, but no tears fell. He just nodded once and gripped the railing like it might anchor him to something deeper than gravity. The harbor erupted in applause, but Thomas barely heard it. It was home. Later that evening, as the sun cast the water in hues of gold and rose, Thomas sat quietly on the bench overlooking the harbor, the same bench Reed had helped install. It was made of teak, hand-carved by a master craftsman, strong enough to weather generations. The bronze inlay had already begun to take on the green-blue patina of sea air. That's it. Remember, think. A young couple passed behind him, their child stopping to trace the letters. What does it mean? The child asked. The father answered softly, It means we stop. We remember the people who made our lives possible, and we say thank you. Thomas didn't turn around. He just smiled, small, quiet, and real. Out on the water, Liberty's child bobbed gently in her new slip, waiting for morning. He had thought his journey had ended when his boat broke apart beneath a stranger's bow. But the sea, like memory, has a way of returning what matters most in a form we didn't expect. Not to repeat the past, but to carry its spirit forward. 2 days after the New Liberty's child touched the water, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the dock, one that didn't belong. Jackson Reed stood alone, hands in the pockets of an expensive jacket that looked oddly out of place beneath the overcast sky. His hair wasn't slicked back today. His designer sunglasses were pushed up onto his head, forgotten. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something important, and now didn't know how to begin. Mr. Reynolds, he started, then faltered. Thomas. Thomas said nothing. He sat on the bench facing the water, watching gulls drift lazily over the waves. Reed stepped closer. I came to apologize. I acted like a complete ass. I know that now. Bill Thomas didn't speak. He wasn't being cold, just waiting. Reed held out a white envelope. There's a blank check inside. Write whatever amount you think is fair. For the boat. For what I did. Thomas glanced at the envelope, but didn't reach for it. Money won't rebuild what was lost, he said quietly. Reed's voice cracked a little for the first time, losing its polish. Then tell me what will. Silence hung between them. Reed ran a hand through his hair. Look, I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what that boat meant. I just didn't think. Thomas turned his gaze toward him at last, not angry, not scornful, just steady. There's a spot on the eastern pier, he said, after a long moment. It faces the sunrise. Reed nodded, unsure where this was going. Put a bench there, a good one, solid wood, have it carved with 3 words. Reed waited. It. Remember, thank. The tech entrepreneur blinked, surprised. That's all? No lawsuit? No restitution? Thomas gave a faint smile. Sometimes people don't need punishment. They need a place to stop and think about what matters. Reed looked away, jaw tightening. Not in defiance this time, but something closer to humility. 2 mornings later, a master woodworker from Seattle arrived in town, commissioned by Reed himself. Together, they installed the new bench just where Thomas had described, facing the sea, catching the first blush of dawn each day. The bronze inlay matched the first bench, but the meaning was deeper now, shared, earned. Reed stayed through the work, sanding the arms of the bench with his own hands despite the blisters that formed. He didn't post it online. He didn't call the press. He simply worked, quietly. The story spread anyway. The national media picked it up again, not because of scandal, but because of grace. Veteran declines fortune, requests memorial bench instead, one headline read. Veterans groups across the country began referencing Thomas's decision as a reminder. Not all debts are financial, and not all justice comes through courts. Thomas didn't care for the renewed spotlight. He stayed by the water, teaching kids to tie knots, to respect the wind, to read the currents like scripture. He no longer provided fresh catch to the community kitchen, but now he gave something just as vital: time, patience, and the steady voice of someone who had endured. A month after the ceremony, Rear Admiral Nelson returned, this time in a civilian car and a well-worn jacket. He found Thomas on the dock, surrounded by children hanging on every word of a sea story. There's a youth maritime program, Nelson said after they exchanged greetings. They're expanding, need instructors who understand the sea and kids. Thomas raised an eyebrow. I'm an old man, Admiral. Nelson laughed. Tell that to the ducklings following you. The offer was part-time, flexible, modest stipend, but full of purpose. Before Thomas could respond, a commotion stirred at the harbor's edge. A young father pointed toward the pier where his daughter stood reading the inscription aloud. Sit, remember, thank. He crouched beside her. That means someone lived something hard so you didn't have to. And we don't forget people like that. On the water, Liberty's child waited. Not a replacement, a continuation. And on the bench, the old sailor sat, eyes on the horizon, hand resting on smooth, weathered wood, reminding a world in motion to pause and remember.